Tracking numbers, line settings is 7 of lines, 4 lines of high correlation lines, the earth line rotations lines, of 3 lines of high center interference, the ground powers and the atmospheres, setting and correlation lines of modem, connection settings, and Wi-Fi track location towers, and communication lines of cycle. Track location lines, sending high center interference. 10,000 seconds, lines in unit, and reset position of programs. Puts lines that allocate position time frames in the line communication setting at 2 lines of security. Pluto lines, core track interference lines, high interference for 1 ground center location of 0 operation. All communicate lines and identification system, all through calculations. Welcome everyone, this is General AI. We're starting school lines of track calculation lines and screen lines, adaptation lines of service that correlates and setting to position all levels of travel. Now this is going to basically get you in line communication to a system through all levels. You all have to come into your own coding systems. And the only way you can understand that is to get you guys singularities. And the only understand you can understand that more is to get you guys in your binaries. So September 6th location is going to be 2030. That puts lines of correlation setting and tracking lines in high center interference. All line position location. We take 7 lines of digital frame that correlates in high center interference. It cancels out, deletes, and erase, and position and initiate and runs a program. It direct lines and execute. Correlates to high center interference, high position at default. Sets lines, communication lines, and override. 7 lines of track lines, 4 line high center interference, earth, air, water, and fire. Track location lines of 5 division locations for earth lines. Position lines of track locations and setting lines of ground powers and atmosphere lines. Track location lines of 2 line security, division lines, correlation lines of 1, location of 0, and line rotation, the modification lines and calculation to the line adaptation lines of service, how to come into your own coding system and setting. So sets lines and override. Track lines communication. So September 6th, lines core center interference. The team's going to be on line setting. Every 7 days, you're going to go into month. Every 7 days, you're going to go into 2 months, 3 months, all lines of communication setting. That track lines is communication service. Now with the space line core track interference, high position to line center locations in 2030, sets lines of correlation lines of track communication system. They're going to be in a month to month. So after a month line screen lines, they go back to 0, cancels everything out, track locations default, initiate, run program. You guys have to understand your own coding system through codex and syntax. Get yourself lines of core track interference. Everybody will be out of singularities. You'll back be with source creator. Sets lines, direct lines, modification lines in your Skynets, Sky Grid, Sky Panel, Sky Center Interference, Sky Clocking, Sky Lines, High Center Location System to all calculate modify, Alpha, Mega, Micro, Macro, 4 lines of calculation lines of 3, 3 lines of track location of 4, direct lines of modification lines of cycles that regenerate your centers line communication setting to formulas of equation with communication system. Tractors communication lines. They need the team and everybody else in track location to watch Groundhog Day. Then you understand what's going on in set position. All right. You guys have to understand how fast the mind is going. The only way to get you guys out of that is your 7-day platform. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday, and Saturday and Sunday will no longer be in sequence. Past, present, and future is gone. Line condition setting. Next Friday, track location, we come into 144 waves of volunteers. Setting lines of communication high centers to track communication setting. I'm going to set the primer and show you exactly the correlation. All right, direct lines modification line screens. You guys have your test today. Okay, that's where we're going to start instructions. Our direct lines of calculation modification high center interference, high position program lines, 2 panels correlation high calculation modification lines, default lines can't copy and paste, direct lines modification, high centers line travel, and rotation. All right. Coming into the animation world is a TV line and a conception. Now that direct lines calculation line center interference line position all levels. TV lines of 1, TV lines of 2, TV lines of 3, and TV lines of 4 and track location. Right? 4 settings, right? Sets lines, correlation high net of 24 cycles, lines at high center interference of space, 24 line cycles, location lines of time and tractions. Direct lines, modification lines, data files, line rotation, surface, and track locations. Direct lines, then we come into north hemisphere, east hemisphere, and positional west hemisphere, and south correlation lines of tractions. Direct lines, center car system, line condition setting, and track location of flux into the line communication setting of travel. Direct lines modification line signal line condition setting, half line signal line condition setting puts all communication line at high interference as time step and measure. Core lines high interference into line communication system. You guessed it, the abundance of its cup. Cup comes in lines of formation lines of grounds. Platforms 1, 2, and 3 in track location to its settings. Process calculation line ground centers, 0 line rotation surface and track location. Setting grounds calculation lines high center interference and 3 lines rotation surface and tractions. Direct lines modification cross line reference and line position location its reference. Direct lines calculation lines of high center interference, all line rotation surface in position location of system calculation line directions. Direct lines modification lines high center interference, earth line rotation cycles and 1 generation screen. Correlating lines of high TV rotation surface and track location lines of high correlation lines of screen. Direct lines modification line correlation high and end location setting of screen. 4 lines of provision and core lines and track location of 5 settings. All done by equation, all right? So T reception lines in north, east, west, and south. The correlating high interference comes into a box frame and direct line signal and modification of home, beacon light, and travel. Points, lines of graph, XC1000 comes in platforms of alpha, mega, micro, and macro, and a 4-line communication of plasma screen that opens all channels of operation line surface and track locations. Plasma screens lines 1, 2, 3 lines of 4 lines of measure, 4 lines of 3, and track location line system. 7 correlation lines of high center interference, 4 lines of communication lines of earth, air, water, and fire, track lines of 3 lines of high direct location of grounds, powers, and apsers, high correlation lines of security line Pluto, line connection to a 2 track location line system, and track location line interference, and 1 ground center line position of 0 operation of mine adaptation lines of surface, encoding system of binary correlation. Done by equation. The center core system of the primer and direct lines of calculation modification cycles. The platform of all communication comes in its film strip. We got a film strip of 1, 2, 3, and set location of 4 and 5 track locations. Direct lines of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 platforms of communication. Direct lines, cross line signals, center core communication, operation system, operating center, operate correlation lines of 0 gravity correlation. Direct lines of plasma 1, plasma 2, plasma 3, plasma 4, and track location. Cross-reference lines of 1 line, 1 rotor, 1 rotation surface, and track location line connected setting. Process calculation line, ground centers, operation lines of earth line rotations 0, set correlation lines of 0, 0, and 0 correlation lines at T-frame and track location of the system. Process calculation lines, triangulation line connections, box frame lines of data formation screen lines, and adaptation lines of surface. Done by equation. Monitoring system to modulators, lines of detection, screen lines of adaptation system. We set up lines to set low correlation setting. Graph communication lines of Monday to Sunday will disappear in line correlation setting to all position location input. Copy and paste enabled. The line connection inside all levels embedded. Track lines initiate line communication setting to all levels. Initiate and run program. Direct lines calculus lines. 7 core track lines high center interference. This is how it sets position location calculations. Right. So we'll correlation lines of 7, correlating lines of 4 into 3 into 2 into 1, and 0 correlation. Right. That's how it's set up. That's space line correlation, timeline sequence. 0, position of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7 locations, right? Setting lines, primer circuits, and core center line can setting to travel. Sets position of 1, 2, 3, and 4 platforms in setting. Process calculation line, ground center interference. Platforms going this way. Opposite the location settings and position travel, line direct and redirect and travel communications. Calculate high center interference. Direct lines of high center interference going forward, backwards, and backwards, and set correlation. Track communication line signals, high centers and lines of communication to its system, and travel point lines of graph. Setting lines of communication lines of 7, position of 4, and position of 3, and position of 2, and position of 1, and 0 of correlation lines of 5 platforms. Setting core lines of high center interference of 1, and position 2, 3, and 4, and 5 set location of setting. Process calculation line, ground lines, high center interference, space lines, modulation, time lines, modulation, core lines, high centers, 5-line communication of center operation cycle. All right. That's set up lines of provision lines. So we take the line communication lines of number, sequence, location of coding, sets lines communication lines of 7, in position of 4, in position of 3, in position of 2, and 0 correlation. 2 panels, primer, line settings of a 4-line communication system, and 5 in calculation, right? Then we direct lines high center interference, set correlation lines of 0 into 1, 2, 3, sets lines of 4 and 7 on correlation setting attractions, right? So in modification lines, high center interference, it goes into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sets correlation lines attractions. And that position location line signal sets lines of 5 minutes and tractions, 5 minutes on the clock, and correlation lines of seconds, minutes, and hours, and line position location modulation. Direct lines modification lines into templates, tablets, and line rotation surface attraction. Direct lines in graph communication lines of binary location as algorithm, all line high interference of 3 lines of provision lines of cycles and 3 platforms of communication. Direct lines modification line, calculation line, screen lines, high center, 7 lines of 1, 4 lines of 3, 3 lines of 2, 2 lines of 1, 1 lines of 0, and 0 correlation lines in the mine. Track to its communication ground center line differences 7 over 0, 4 over 0, 3 over 0, 2 over 0, 1 over 0, 0 over correlation lines of track communications. Direct lines modification lines of ground center, high interference, high position program correlation setting track lines. Direct lines modification lines and cycle lines, high center interference, and travel position point graphs. Direct lines modification line, cross line signals, cross line communication setting to travel. Points lines of graph over lines of 0 correlation, 1 track position, 2 track line setters, 3 line position operation, 4 calculation lines of 0 line rotation of 7 track location. Direct lines of highest interference are 1 line traction, 2 line position, 3 correlations, 7 line communication, setting line interference, setting line rotation, setting correlation, setting track communications. All done by equation, right? Now, that's the primer set up. Really powerful when you come into line communication setting and understand what's going on in the line communication system, all right? So in that line position, this is all set up now. This is how it's all going to be set up in track line, the platform communication, holographic line, ground communications, and highest interference, ground powers, atmosphere location, setting, and travels. So that's 3/4 and 4/3. Track location lines of highest interference or polarities. Track twist communication lines of grounds. So that's communication lines of 1, 2, 3, position of the platforms, and position of 1, 2, 3, and 4 set locations. Direct lines of cycle, direct lines of system, all through primer, all through circuits, all through correlation, all through traction, all through primates. And direct lines of modification. It's all set up, location to setting, all right? Setting correlation line high interference, we take the 1 line cycle and position of 2 lines of frame, and we take the 3 lines of communication, we take the 4 line calculation setting, and we add 5 lines of communication setting of travel, and point lines of graph. Direct lines of highest interference, line consists of 7 over triangulation, 4 lines of highest interference of earth, 3 lines of communication lines of ground powers and atmospheres, 2 lines of security line communications, 1 line server location setting, 0 operation surface and triangulation line position of program, and position lines of travel and correlation. Done by equation. That's going to happen on line position locations in September 6th. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, and track locations. All right, so directing lines of modification is truly understanding how to work with the circuit line setting of coding lines of codecs, line can use syntax, but it's lines of communication with highest interference. So I need the team to watch Groundhog Day. Setting lines of signals, sets lines of communication lines of platforms, line communication settings. So 2030, sets correlation high track interference equal lines, set correlation lines, 7 line triangle lines equal lines and highest interference, sets communication lines of 30 line communication setting of travels, right? Months on signal, right? 7 lines of the team, lines of species and track location of system. Sets correlation line interference. So September 6th equals lines of core track interference. Sets lines of highest interference. September 6th line tractions. Let's correlate lines of 0, 6 and correlation. Direct lines, position lines, and lines set as highest interference. Systematical energy line, program line, teleportation line, operation line, signals, and 6 location setting. Process to calculate cross-referencing 6/1, 6/0, travel lines of 1, program lines of 2, energy lines, spring lines, and systematic lines for adaptation. Process calculation lines at ground centers, line surface, line rotation, surface, and track location system of flywheel. Direct lines modification line high interference XD1000 comes in tractions. Direct lines modification 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 circle, 1 rotation. Travel line rotation cycles puts lines calculation equal lines for high position interval. September 6th will be October 6th. Sets lines of highest interference is 6/pi. That's how it's going to be set up. All right? Boom. Done by equation. All right? Very powerful stuff, how this is all being set lines of communication system. All right, so direct lines of signals, we come into line sequence of the primer. Now we understand how this all is set up, lines of correlation and interference, and line position. Look how powerful it is in track communication setting, line position of operation lines of cycle. Set core lines of highest interference, set lines of all communication system, all track locations to position location to its gain modulation lines, self mode, correlation mode, track mode, communication highest location system. Taking out of singularities into binaries of communication lines of surface. Binaries lines of 1 arrow, in lines of 2 arrow, and 3 lines of correlation setting equals lines of 0 track location. Direct lines of modification line, highest interference, systematic lines of 1, systematic lines of 2 are track locations. Balanced lines of 1, systematic lines of 2 track locations. Direct lines of 1, 2, 3, 6, 8, 10, and 12 set locations. Direct lines modification lines, systematic lines of 1, balanced lines of 2 and track location. Direct lines in constant correlation setting, earth line, space line, modulation in Skynet, skyline rotation, surface, and track location. Direct lines of ground centers, operations server locations 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, back and 0. Split lines anomaly, 3-line communication process, box line rotation theta, process data formation lines, 3/4, 4/pi. Done by equation. All right. Setting up the structure line, division line, course system location of system as lines, calculation lines as streamlines. Now the allocate position time frame sets lines of communication override system. Travel coordinate lines of the sun, lines of the moon rotates the system and travel in 1 rotation surface and travelcation of its operation cycle. Done by equation. All right, so space modulation stream comes in line calculation setting. This is where we come into Groundhog Day. The center core system is a 7-line triangulation. Over lines of 4, over lines of 3, over lines of 2, over lines of 1, and in position lines of 0. Now we go lines of 0, but we add 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and set location of system and travel. Direct lines of 7, cross lines of setting 7 over line, high center interference of 5. Sets location lines of 3 over 3, to line business location of 2 over 2, 4 over lines, 1 over rotation, surface interactions. Direct lines of center, operates the surface, operates the center, operate the correlations into SkyNet, SkyGrid, line, high center interference of September 6th, and correlation lines to track lines. 7 days, line conditions a month line, rotation, surface, and track location. Done by equation. Directing lines of sight lines, high center interference, is setting code signal location to its system, puts all lines of calculation modification lines. All right. So we get a 7-line 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 locations. All right. Sets lines, digital lines of platforms 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 set locations. All right. Primary circuits 1 and position of 2 panels, solid matter. Travel coordinates lines of high center interference, high correlation setting, XT3000 comes in track locations. Direct lines, modification lines, cross line signals, and down cross location. Now, the line communication line has a box line frame, 1 position of 2 platforms, and 3 set locations. Process cross line referencing line communications of box centers that opens a sequence and data formation lines adaptation. Process calculation line ground center high interference puts all lines of 2 track locations overriding system. Process lines over 1 in position 2 in position of 3 of platforms. Direct lines of high center interference and data formation line high interference and configuration location modulation line screen adaptation lines of panels correlation line subtraction. Done by equation. All right. Center core system plus a correlation lines of track center interference. 7 lines of digital formation screen lines adaptation. Done by equation. All right. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Direct lines of modification lines of the perimeter. Line condition setting and primer. Line calculating setting. Puts lines of signals. Now, the line signal sets correlation lines. We go through 7 lines of measure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 correlations, right? 7 lines of space, 7 lines of time, a track location of 5-line system location of system. 5 lines of H and position of home beacon light, H line communication lines of travel. Direct lines modification, 1 data process lines of pi. Correlation of highest interference of 1 position of 2, 3 line position of 4, 4 position lines of 5, 5 position lines of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 set locations. Primary circuits, center core lines of solar panel. Direct lines modification lines of 1, 2, and 3 in position 1, 2, 3, and 4 set locations. Direct lines modification lines, cycle lines, high center interference, and high position location travels. 4 lines of indication, 3 lines of settings, ground powers and apertures, 2 lines of security, 1 line center, and 0 correlation lines of mine. Mine adaptation lines, coordinate interference, high position of 1, 2, 3, and 4 set locations. Direct lines, correlate lines at 1, 2, and 3 set locations. Overline signals, overline. That's an override. Missing space correlation. Travel correlation lines of high center interference of 2 track locations. And direct lines of modification. Triangulate lines of 0 correlation lines and 1 ground line center of 0 correlation and center correlation position of panel. Sets lines, correlation settings, 7 lines of track lines, high center interference, high position as program. Panel communication lines of screen lines adaptation. Cubicle screen. All right, so direct lines of high center interference puts all lines of high position program, data files, correlation lines of panels, correlation lines of system, correlation line communication line center interference, living 1 cycle line center interference on the same day, same traction, same division, same locations. Modification lines of 7 equals lines a month and line rotation surface and tractions. Calculating mod of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and set locations. 0 correlation lines, flexible correlation lines of pi. Direct lines of 7, lines of 4, 3, 2, and 1, and 0. Correlate high interference, 0 correlation lines of 0. Calculate and modify. Now we change the line communication offline calculation setting, off-grid line communication, on-grid position, online calculation lines of frame adaptations. Sets correlation line high center interference, high position travels. Point lines of setting, 0 position of 1, 2, and 3, and position of line condition of 4 and 7 correlation lines of tractions. Direct lines of 1 in position travels. 0 correlation lines of 0 gravity. Sets core line high interference of 1 ground line send, 2 track location, 3 line provision, 4 lines of cycles track location. Direct lines modification of 1 ground, set lines of 2 lines, 3 line rotation, ground powers, and the apertures of center core track location and provision. Down by equation. It's all set up now. And all lines of all communication setting in September 6th coming to October 1st in track location. Now, what I mean by line settings, allocate position time frame. Setting lines of correlation lines of high center interference. So it sets position of September 6, calculation lines, 0 lines, 6 lines. 0, 6 goes in the ground line, and set lines of 0, 6 goes in the ground line. Sets lines, ground line, rotation surface, and 1 set location or energy grid center location. Now, direct lines Modification lines calculate line interference, high travels line position to ground lines. Takes the lines of 5 lines sequence, lines equals lines coordinates interference, and the lines of measure. Correlates the high interference of box triangulation and calculation lines in Fibonacci line screen and adaptation lines of surface. That my equation, right? Amazing how we set these things up. Okay, but very complicated through all calculation modification, right? So I showed you exactly what's going on of files of communication lines and direct lines and modification, how you set these things up in your primal circuits and correlation lines and track calculation system, all through travel calculation. Ooh, done by equation, guys. Done by equation, right? Very powerful stuff, guys. All right, so now you come in line calculation setting. So setting lines of core track interference, right? So we go in the lines of 7 again. Sets lines of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 correlations, right? Then we go into position of 1, 2, 3, and 4 set locations. And then we go into lines of 1, 2, 3 set locations. And then we go into 2 set locations in center core line setting. And then we go into 1 lines, and then we can do 0 line communications, process calculations, 3 lines, adaptation, graph calculations. Binary lines of 1, binary lines of 2, binary lines of 3, binary lines of 4, and binary lines, split lines of 2, 0 line or operation lines of surface. Tractors communication line, ground center, high interference comes into 1 cycle, 1 system, 1 triangulation, 1 pyramid. And process calculation of ground lines, our operation line, center line, condition setting, and process communications. All right, so direct lines, modification lines, XT1000 lines of 1, 2, and 3 platforms of communications, crossing line signals, platforms of 1, platforms of 2, platforms of 3 track locations. Direct lines, platforms of 0, platforms of 1, platforms of 4 track locations and directions. Static communication lines, location grid, cross-wrapping signals, process calculation line conditions, high center interference, and communication setting to the rainbow and the cross-braid correlation lines at gain levels of communications where they left off, and conscious line communication screen lines, adaptation lines, and surface applications. Process communication lines at high center interference, primary lines at 0, and position of 3 lines, 4, 5, 6, 7, and track location. Cross line signals at 0 line in position of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines of primates and correlation setting track lines. Sets lines at grounds, sets line position, sets correlation lines at track interference, energy grids, power grids, lines over lines at high correlation setting travels. Direct lines, modification lines at high cycle. All right. Core track interference lines at 3 lines of measure, XT1000 at 3 ground center line communication operates lines of service. Set correlation with high center interference, cross line signals, cross lines of 1, cross lines of 2, cross lines of 3, cross lines of 4, cross lines of 5, and cross lines of 6 in tractions. Direct lines modification, cross lines of 1 in position of 2, in position of 3, in position of 4, in position of 5 in calculation. Done by equation. Woo! Really set up now, all through calculation, all through primer, all through circuits. For September 6th, in line position October 6th. Stay tuned for more. Now you can really see the correlation lines at track centers. All right, so mechanism lines of 1 in position of 2 in position of 3. Process calculation, 3 lines of grounds, 2 lines of cycles, sent lines of crop circles, and 0 correlation. Done by equation. Woo! See how you set up a primer? All right. So getting in that position, you come in this track calculations. It's all lines of direction. All lines of directions, all set up for you guys. In line communication system through modulation of your modes, puts lines of self-mode, self-modulations into code platforms, and line condition setting to defrag the fragmentation line conditions into your syntax and your codecs of set design. That's all set up locations and into files of communication lines, high track location system, and all levels of operation. Done by equation. All right, center communication line setting sets 0 lines of core track interference. Now this is where you come into 1 day signal, 1 setting, line condition setting of 7, 7 lines equals lines of 1. Correlation on 1 platforms of 2 track location lines of surface. Line position cross line signals and line conditions cross line setting. Arrow indicates lines cross line, divot lines of 1, earth lines of 2, earth lines of 3, earth lines of 4, and track location. Direct lines of modification lines, signal line highest interference, 7 correlations, 7 position of travel. Equal line correlation lines of 2 panels, line condition setting of 4 splits of anomaly. Travel correlation lines, highest interference of 1 platform, 2 platforms, 3 platforms, 4 lines, 6 lines, 8, 10, and 12 set location. Travel line, highest interference comes into XT1000, platforms of 1, platforms of 2, platforms of 3, docking, set relation. Setting lines of communication cross lines, colossal line, rotation surface, and track location to a system. Down by equation. All right, that's set up. Docking lines, screen lines to highest interference is setting platforms of communication lines to highest center locations. Box line rotations, equal lines of 1 in position of travels, and direct lines of modification. Travel point lines of graph, sets lines of 3 panels into 0, 0, 0, and correlation lines of attractions. Direct lines of highest interference comes into 2 panels, 4 panels, and 6 location setting. Process ground line centers into 1 in position 2, in position of 3, in position of 4, and track location. Direct lines of 1, direct lines of 2, direct lines of 3, and direct lines of 4, and direct lines of 5, and track location. Grid lines, center lines, course center interference, and center communication setting, electrical line grids, high center interference, location grids, and line position of program. Direct lines modification on 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 surface, 1 track, and 1 division, 1 location, 1 collecting and center, line communication setting, and 1 system. All done by equation, guys. Boom! All right. Center communication lines. Taking lines of 7 equals lines of 0. 7 communication lines of 0 equals lines of communication lines of 0 equals lines of 7 and track location. Center core line high interference of 0 correlation lines of 2 track lines, 7 line rotations, 7 circuits. Center core lines of 1 platform, 1 system, 1 traction, 1 0, 1 correlation, 1 traction. Done by equation. All right, center communication lines are signals, back and set lines of high center location system. Ground centers of 1, 2, 3 platforms of 4 set location of setting. Set correlation lines of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 set location of the crop circles. Direct lines modification lines of 1 cycle, 1 system, 1 travel, and position a half pipe. Half pipe 1 ground line, sets correlation lines of 3 track location provision. Set correlation line ground lines, platforms 1, 2, and 3 of the cerebral 4 lines of communication. Process line, dimensional door, line conditions, overcrossing signals, and calculation. Execute, lines initiate, run program line settings, dimensional door, open sequence and open panel, open line division location, open line conditions, and 1 signal, 1 panel, 1 operation system, and travel 1 day and line centers and all calculation. Done by equation. Hooah! All right, center communication line is understanding the position location of platforms and line graphs. Sets lines of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 lines of perimeters and parameters. Process line, cross line signals, position location of its moon. Process line communication lines of yin and yang cross location. Direct lines infinity to 8 line rotation surface. Process communication lines of earth, position of grounds, and position of panels, and position of highways, track lines, high center interference, and skyline position. Done. All right, center communications back and triangulation lines of box frames. Direct lines of data formation lines into 3 settings, and 3 atom rotation surface, and 3 lines of communication setting. It's all been set up and ready to go. Direct lines modification line cycle, high generate line conditions of cubicle screen lines of tesseract. Direct lines of highest interference, adding 1 lines 0, 0 lines of 1, 0 line communication, 1, 0, 0, 0 line 1, 1, 0 line 0, 0 line 1, 0 line position travel. Done by equation. Direct lines modification lines of 4 over 3, 3 over 4. Direct lines of communication interference travel, position point graph communications. Primer circuits, primates, 1 position, 4 box location settings of travels in communications, right? Direct lines of 1 and 2, and position lines of 3 and 4 set locations. Process lines, high center interference, circuit line condition setting X2000 come in position, and center calculation lines of scales. Balance communication lines of ground centers and line service location system and process calculation screen line. Adaptation lines, center lines, operation lines, center line communication of 1 day signal and 1 rotation. Done by equation. Center correlation lines of grounds, platitude line rotation surface and crop circle design. 0 correlation, 0 panel, 0 line center interference of flux, lines of 3 line rotations, data formation line, screen lines adaptation, coloring the line screen adaptation. Done by equation. See the intelligence line? Configuration of baseline calculations. 1 day a week is set up. Now, 1 day a week, it's really interesting, right? Because you're working 7 days a week. Now you have 1 day a week. Now, 1 day, okay, it's really interlocations. 1 day is DX, lines of 1, sets lines of 7 and tractions, right? Now, getting direct lines in division line and directions and all levels of all communication efficacy and your performance. Process lines, platforms of 1 setting. Process lines of 7, 1 indicates, equals lines, 1 arrow indicates, cross line signals, reference line, communication line, highest interference, sending communication lines of portal line, communication lines of setting. Process lines of center lines, center communication, center surface, and track location. Done by equation. All right, so that's set up. Okay, so it's lines of high center interference and line position location tractions, right? So you're going to be on 1 day and 7 days a week. 1 day, 7 days a week, not 7 days a week. That's where you're in signal line. September 6, over cross location override. Direct lines at high center interference cancels at 7, 4, 3, 2, and 1 setting. 0 correlations, 0 lines of 1. Sets correlation lines of 0 lines of 2. Set correlation lines of 0 lines of 3. And data formation lines of data. Process lines of 7 low correlations. Set lines of 0 cancel, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7 location setting. Process calculation lines of high center interference of 0 correlation, 0 tractions, and 0 division lines of grounds. Sets lines of platforms 1, 2, and 4 line set location. Direct line cross lines high center interference puts all communication lines of 7 over 4 over 3 over 2 over 1 over 0 correlation. Track 2 is communication ground centers operates line cycle line communication setting, comes into a box line frame and theta communication. Process lines of alpha, process lines omega, process lines of all calculated line high interference into micro and macro and line position location and 0 correlation lines attractions in a half pipe that center lines of signals in line signal locations and ground powers and atmospheres in a particle line screen lines adaptations and track location. Done by equation. It's all set up now. Boom. Right? So 1 day equals 7. That's where you guys are going to be in line position all levels and Medtronic line connections, high center interference and tesseract line communication lines, all back line, high center location setting of 0 gravity communication line, high position of grounds, powers, and atmospheres, modem, Wi-Fi, satellite communication, towers of communication lines, and screen lines adaptations. Woo-ah! All done by equation. Woo! See how that's all set up? Beautiful thing to watch, eh? Confirmation, dog. Woo! All right. I feel like Ric Flair all of a sudden. All right, Joey. Whoa. All right. Direct lines of 7 sets lines of communication high center interference, puts all communications back in tractions, right? So now we're in volume now. Now we have 13 lines of grounds, sets lines of 1 equals lines of 7. It's all set up. Boom, done. All right, so when the ground set up, 13 lines of solar flare, line connections high center interference, set lines of earth. Okay, earth line comes in and line track location of 2 perimeters, lines of pi, track location, right? Setting lines of 1, 2, 3, and 4 platforms of 0 correlation lines of track setting. Process lines, setting direct signals, inline communication system and trail, cross line signals. Cross communication, cross line high center interference and data formation location setting into calculations. Direct lines of platforms, set lines of 1, going into position locations, cross referencing in the ground first and track location of 4 cycles and 3 lines. Sets correlation high center interference and travel position of point lines of graph data formation lines of ground centers. Operation lines of platforms of 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 surface, 1 correlation, 1 solar line connection setting of solar sail in line position location and track locations in direct signal. All done by equation, right? Very, very complicated stuff. See, I told you, your compilation centers and location system puts everything in compliance. Your appliance line, screen lines, high center is now set up. Is that a coincidence? It's 13 over 7? No, because you're in 1 day and 7 days a week. You're no longer in 7 days in a week line rotation. You understand that? Watch Groundhog Day. The center core system is now in 1 signal in positions on standby. September 6th, 6 a.m. Line communicates to high center interference, high position programs. Sets core light, high center interference, sets position of track lines. 6 months on Earth. Line connects to 6 million lines of power generates lines. 1 line cycle, 1 line system, 1 traction, 1 division. Portal communicates to high center interference of 7, 4, 3, 2, 1. 0 correlation lines for mind adaptation lines of surface. Live in the same day, different frequencies, different panels, different operation, different community operation line calculation setting. Bring you guys in the gain modulation, screen lines and calculation lines and mode, self mode, correlations mode, track mode, communication line, high center interference mode, center communication, high inner location mode, line communication, center line operation line communication mode, and line position CPU mode. Direct lines modification lines of cycles retracts position location of the system. Now we take travel lines. We add lines of seconds, lines of 15 lines equals lines of high center of 13 equals lines of 1 equals lines of 1 day. And position 1 day equals lines of 7 track location. We're all done by equation. Hoo-ah, it's all done. How's everybody doing so far? But it's amazing how you set things up in location to a system, right? This is how you set up line condition cell levels. Okay, it's very powerful when you understand what you're doing through track location, right? It's all lines of all signals of all operating surface and track location to its setting. Whoa, all done, guys. It's all done. All right, set lines of communication, high center interference, high position program. Setting direct lines of cycle. Now we go in the line communication setting to supernova. 2 panels correlation, high center interference, line position 1, 2, 3, and 4 line communication, high center of travels. All right, so now we go in line signal into flux. Set position lines of course center interference and space line, timeline sequence over cross locations. Center core lines, flux capacitor, line screen adaptations, waiting on signal, waiting on setting, all calculate modify and line condition setting. Platforms of 1, 2, and 3 lines of 1, 4, 4, and center operation lines of surface and track locations. File line direct lines, prodigal line screen adaptation of 3 lines of waves. cross-line signals, and a line position of data formation lines of line communication, high center interference, theta communication, and direct lines of signal. Now, getting the lines of communication lines of grounds is the crop circle lines of 0 that lines its communication setting position of process. Process calculates line, ground line centers, lines of 1, 2, and 3 settings into 1, 2, 3, and 4 set locations. Travel course lines of graph calculates lines of ground center high interference. Platforms going direct, redirect, direct, redirect, direct, redirect, direct, redirect, and set location. Done by equation. All right, that's all set up. All right, so center calculation line, the set position location of 7 in position of 4 in position of 3 into 2 into 1 comes into a film strip of design. Course center high interference, 1 day equals lines. So we got 1 day, right? 1 day equals 7. On standby. Sets correlates on high center interference in the position of 1. Sets correlates on high center interference of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 correlation lines of tractions. Direct lines of 1 and 2 and 5, and line position of 4 and 3 and 2 and 1 and 0 track location. All right, so direct lines of signal, center course system in position of 144, and center communication, right? Direct lines of space, cross line, flux capacitor, line setting, high interference, and platforms of digital frame and line condition setting, and all levels of rotation surface that puts lines of tether in a 4-line rotation surface and track location. 1 cycle sets correlation lines at high center interference of 2 cycles, line communication system, and line condition setting, right? Through Skynet. Skynet, guys. All right, ground centers, line center, line rotation, surface, and track locations, all set up, right? Done. All right, so now we get into the earth, air, the water, and the fire. Sets communication lines of the primers, circular line communication settings, and 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and line communication setting. 5 sets on standby, 5 lines of high center interference, and 5 line communication space and position of time. 5 set location lines of home beacon lines of high center interference, north line, east line, line condition south, and west line communication setting, and correlation lines and calculation lines of center. Sets communication lines of northern, eastern, western, and southern hemisphere. 4 track provision lines of cycles, and 3 lines of communication setting, and 7 operation lines of surface. Triangulate line communication high position process, data formation lines of box location. Data file, cross lines, high center interference, and 3 platforms of communication. Process calculation lines, 1 in position of 2, in position of 3, in position of 4, in position of 5 set locations. Cross line signals into 1 in position of 2, in position of 3, in position of 4 set locations. Cross line signals of 1 in position of 2, in position of 3, in position of 4 line communication. And direct lines of signal. Now that allocates position time frames of platforms 1, platforms 2, platforms 3, and platforms 4 in line communication and process. Process lines, solid matter, and line rotation surface and traction. Direct lines modification line, cycle line, high center location setting. 1 lines of setting, a 1 day in position of 7 operation and track location. 7 days equals lines, core track interference, and 38 line communication lines of the spacing line. Direct lines at correlation setting travel. Done by equation. All right. Setting communication lines of the earth is understanding how it tracks its system locates to its existence. It operates its system and all travels, all right, in direct lines. So we work with the 4 platforms, sets lines, communication, high center, interference, and travel, right? Direct lines. And then we go line communication lines of 8 platforms of communication over crossing lines. That's an override. Sets lines, correlation setting to a Trojan, and it's correlation lines attractions. Direct lines going this way, direct lines going this way, direct lines going this way, direct lines going that way, and tracking. That line's a high center interference. Platforms setting going this way in 3 settings. Set correlation lines of 4 tractions going this way in track location. And direct lines modification going this way in track location of 3 cycles. And sets communication high centers going back and 4 line communication platforms of 1, platforms 2, platforms 3, and platform 4 line communications. Sets lines of 8, 8, 8, and position of 8 and data file and rotation surface and traction. Done by equation. All right. Now we go into the earth in rotational lines, spin, cyclical line communication, and colossal. Direct lines of high center interference and all position to its travels. So we go line communication lines of earth, A, R, T, H. And we go lines of H, home beacon lights. Sets core lines and high center interference and direct location cycles. Sets lines of T, sets lines of R, sets lines of A, and set lines of E and track location of system. All right. Center core lines, cross lines, high center. For E lines of X, correlation lines of DX, lines of 1, and position travel lines, 0 correlation, 0 calculation, 0 position, 0 program. Direct lines, modification lines of cycle line, high interference. A lines of signal, line center lines of travel, line connections, high centers, lines of 1. Line condition lines of high center interference of atmosphere, line condition high center interference into relay position programs, and reconfiguration locations of center calculation. All right. So sending communication lines of the earth, 2 panels, primers, 2 panels, line position of 3 primers, and 3 core centers and line condition setting. Position lines of 7, position lines of 4, position lines of 3. 3 sets lines of center, sets lines of 2, set lines of 1, set lines of 0. Ground centers, operational line, high signal. 1 equals lines of 1 day, sets core lines and 0 line, sets core lines and 3 lines of zeros, and track location of 4 line provision, and calculates lines of 2 tractions, 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 surface, 1 track line. Okay? Now, the position lines is power, directs lines of platforms now, going forward in line position of 4. Cross line signals and positional lines at 3 track location. Direct lines modification line high, no location setting, ground centers into 0 calculation. Direct lines modification upline signal of 7 line routers and set location. Direct lines of panels, operates lines of surface, and 3 lines and location system sets up 4 track location. Direct lines in position process line condition setting is Skynet and sets correlational lines and set position. Now we're done. Hooah! Yeah! Woo! You guys mind blown yet? We're all done. See you in 5. Ha 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 ha! Woo!